Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. You're in for another SKYLIT author interview. I'm your host for this episode, Justin Remer, and today I'm talking to Stuart Moore, the novelist, comics writer, and editor who has put together this critical volume, kind of pocket-sized critical volume, called Doctor Strange, A Decade of Dark Magic for the Marvel Age of Comics series. Thanks for being with me, Stuart.
Thanks for having me.
So here's me being forthright. I like comics. I'm not a huge comics guy. I don't really know Doctor Strange, but I got into this series to be like, will this get me into comics? And like, your writing is really good, and I ended up reading a couple of Dormammu issues because of it. We'll talk about Dormammu later, maybe. But just so the folks have a taste of your writing, would you like to read an excerpt from the book?
Sure. Let me frame this a little bit before I get into it.
Yeah, feel free.
The book itself is a mixture. We'll talk about this, but the book itself is a mixture of what I would say comics criticism, comics history, New York history, and personal memoir. And it kind of leads up to an epilogue, my after credits scene, where I tell about my own personal experiences with Steve Ditko, with Stan Lee, and with Doctor Strange. I'm going to read you the Stan one because that one falls in the middle, and I like it. I'm fond of it. So, Stan Lee and me. I worked with Stan a few times, usually long distance. In the mid-2010s, we collaborated on a series of illustrated middle-grade prose novels. When the first one came out, we appeared at a book signing together on the crowded floor of Comic-Con San Diego. It was a fast-moving, enthusiastic affair. Roving mobs of fans, professionals, Delta Quadrant aliens, and would-be film producers surged past all around us. The publisher's rep told us in no uncertain terms, no personalized messages, just sign the books and move it along. Stan, in his 90s, was as game for promotion as ever. By that time, the Stan Show, which I refer to elsewhere in the book, had become second nature to him, a good-humored act he could slip on like a sweater. He had developed some hearing trouble, though, and I soon realized part of my job was to repeat what people said into his ear. "He came all the way from Mexico to meet you," I'd say, trying not to shout, after which Stan would turn to the visitor and say at perfectly normal volume, "Oh, you came all the way from Mexico. That's wonderful." At one point, a reader came up and exclaimed, "This is great! I get to meet my idol." Caught up in the Stan Show, I pointed to my collaborator and quipped, "Yeah, and him too." As I looked away, Stan backhanded me hard on the chest. I turned to him, mortally afraid that I'd offended him. He was grinning. "Nobody likes a wise guy," he growled. That is not the point of the story, however. After the signing was over, Stan took me by the arm. He led me to a quiet corner of the publisher's booth and leaned in. "You wrote the book," he said. I acknowledged that yes, I had written the book. I wasn't sure what he was getting at. Most of my contact with Stan to this point had been through the publisher who had hired me. Stan and I shared credit on the book with his name approximately twice as large as mine and as that of the artist, who had contributed dozens of beautiful full-page illustrations. "I hate that my name's on that book," he continued, "because I didn't do it." I assured him that I had no problem with the credit arrangement. He had created the project, and of course the publisher would want to play up his contribution. At every stage, it had gone through his office for notes and commentary. "Well," he said, "maybe by book 3 it can just be you." I think that's when it struck me. Nobody was listening to us. This wasn't Stan the showman displaying his natural charm for the fans. It wasn't even the Stan who, in humbler moments, would throw around Borscht Belt humor to casually underplay his own contributions. I might be wrong. I wasn't inside his mind. But what I saw was a thoughtful man, a man who'd taken decades' worth of criticism to heart, a man who needed to say something to me and to me alone. He smiled and released my arm like a businessman signaling that our meeting was over. His entourage closed in, and as I watched, they led him off to vanish in the crowd.
That's a great piece. I'm glad you read that one. Yeah.
Yeah, the odd thing about it is it kind of builds on stories about Stan and his assorted, like his complicated relationship with artist Steve Ditko in particular in the early days of Doctor Strange and Spider-Man as well.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I feel like your book often touches on this kind of back and forth, and you even sort of suggest that at certain points it seems like Stan doesn't even quite get the character. Like you pinpoint like the use of the word mystifying to refer to Doctor Strange, and you're like, yes, it could refer to him being mystic, but also maybe Stan was a bit mystified by him.
Yeah, that was particularly true early on. Like Stan acknowledged from the beginning, to some degree, within the hype of the Marvel narrative patter, that Steve Ditko had just kind of brought this thing in, and he wasn't quite sure what to make of it at first. And there are, I think, a couple of months between the first two stories, so they were sort of waiting to see whether there was a decent response to this thing before they continued it, which of course there was. I think later on Stan became very familiar with the character and comfortable with the character, though I do get into the fact that I think Ditko was, and I'm inferring here from interviews as well as just sort of evidence of who worked on which stories and that sort of thing. But Ditko seemed much more interested in Doctor Strange as the magic, almost sort of warrior explorer who would defend the world from other realms. The stuff is very, it's very unearthly. It travels to different dimensions. And Stan seemed almost more interested in him as like the celebrity of the East Village.
Yeah.
And both of those are aspects of the character.
I like the way that the subtitle is A Decade of Dark Magic, and you take us from 63 to 73. And I like the way that you kind of update general American culture, but also just specifically the culture of the village where Doctor Strange would be. So I like that stuff. Yeah,
and so much was going on there at the time. That was the rise of Bob Dylan. That was a folk music cafe. I mean, it was all dramatized in the film A Complete Unknown last year, which I mentioned near the end of the book as well.
Right now there's three. There's more in the way, but right now there's 3 books in this Marvel Age of Comics series. There's the Doctor Strange one, there's the Daredevil one, and there's one on the Mighty Avengers in the 70s.
Yes.
So I'm curious, since this is almost like the pilot stage of it, like what made you decide to zero in on Doctor Strange, or did you have a few ideas?
I did pitch a few ideas. Marvel asked me if I wanted to be interested in this, and I jumped at it because you'd never get a chance to do this kind of writing, not for money anyway, even a little bit of money. But it's like I said, it is a sort of type of critical writing mixed with memoir that really interested me. Doctor Strange, what I did there was I went back to the first stories I had read, which were the stories by writers Steve Englehart and artist Frank Brunner from the early 1970s. And there's a sort of a time loop in there where Doctor Strange travels back to the beginning of the universe and sort of helps restart it, which was very mind-blowing and large scale for the time. And I sort of used that as a conceit to start there and go back in time to the beginning of Doctor Strange and sort of trace the evolution of the character and how it reflected the culture and counterculture of the period and how it influenced it a bit as well.
You said, is it a Pink Floyd cover? Like there was a couple of rock covers that like incorporated Doctor Strange into their artwork or something.
Yeah, and Ken Kesey also was mentioned in Tom Wolfe's book Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Ken Kesey is mentioned as a big fan of Strange Tales with Doctor Strange.
Nice. So I guess, was it the time period that was the most appealing to you because like that's like your comics awakening, or why did you pick this era of Strange, I guess?
I started from the point where I started reading the book, and when I was a kid, I wasn't quite as, I didn't click on the Steve Ditko and Stan Lee stories quite as much. They felt sort of weirdly old-fashioned to me, and now I can see the levels in them a little more. And I can appreciate Ditko's. Ditko was definitely, he was an artist's artist aside from anything else. Like his command of the form is amazing in a way that doesn't always click on a 9-year-old kid or a 16-year-old kid, you know. But I took that and sort of took it back to the East Village in the 60s, which, as I said, was a time of immense cultural churn very fast. And that I found fascinating. I did a lot of research on that. And it's also an area that it wasn't where I lived, but it was. I used to hang out down there a bit when I first moved to New York City in the 1980s. I actually knew. I mentioned a few times, like there was a place I used to go to. It was a sort of a cheery heavy metal bar called the Scrap Bar that it turned out had been the village. I always get this wrong. Gaslight or Gas Lamp, which is it's if you've if you've seen the film A Complete Unknown, it's where Joan Baez goes to find Bob Dylan on the night of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's a very distinctive spot. It's underground. You have to go down a slightly winding staircase to get there. So it kind of resonated with me in some ways too. Like I knew there. I used to go to the. There was a gigantic bootleg record store down there, and they finally they screwed themselves. They just finally they were running ads about all the new bootlegs they had, and every week listing them. And finally, the recording industry just like moved in there with a bulldozer. Like, they couldn't let it happen. It was terrible, but they kind of pushed it a bit.
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, I it's like one of those things I don't need all the details, but you referred to, quote, unlicensed coffee houses. What's an unlicensed coffee house?
Oh, that's just I had to look that up myself. All that means is that I'm not sure I have this exactly right, but I think they weren't licensed for public performances. So they weren't allowed to have, they weren't allowed to really have bands playing or even poetry readings, but most of them did. So they were constantly, and there was a tension, particularly in that part of town, where longtime residents didn't like them because they were noisy. But it was such there were so many young people gathering in that area at the time that it was exciting, and it was an important part of what was going on in the culture at the time. But yeah, they were referred to that way because legally they weren't allowed to do what they were doing.
Yeah. No, I was in Brooklyn like 15 years ago, lived there for a while, and was in the sort of DIY music scene. So I'm well aware of like performing, performance royalty organizations that will come be like, cool, you're having performances, now pay us for that.
Wow. I didn't know that happened. So they would just drop in. They would just
be like, oh, wow. This is a nice DIY venue you have. Please give us all of your money.
Oh, God. Yeah. Oh, that's horrible. Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. I guess maybe we can go through sort of the eras of Doctor Strange. So I will say, as I said, I looked in on a few of the Dormammu stories because the way you described the Dark Dimension, I was like, well, I need to see this. And then when I saw it, I was like, this is indeed ridiculously trippy and great. I did have the background of the movies, but without the comics, I guess maybe even for a listener who doesn't have that background, maybe we can talk a little bit about who is Doctor Strange and how does he develop through this decade.
Before we get to that, I'll mention for another Marvel project I'm writing now, I was just researching the first movie, and I think it's the director, Scott Derrickson, talks about a Doctor Strange blacklight poster from the late 60s that was incredibly important to him, that like this was and influenced the look of the film. Nice. But that was all adapted from the Steve Ditko stuff. The character himself was he's an arrogant, wealthy surgeon who in a car accident loses his surgical ability. His hands develop tremors after that. His nerves are damaged. Unable to live with this, he seeks out cures, and he hears of a holy man called the Ancient One on a remote mountain, and he sort of goes there and seeks out his help. And from there, in order to deal with the treachery of the Ancient One's other disciple, Baron Mordo, he stays through hard sort of study and practice, learns the mystic arts, and becomes, in the process, just a more enlightened person, a higher sort of consciousness, and eventually becomes the sorcerer supreme of our reality, who defends our realm against incursions from outside, from other dimensions. That's pretty much it, I think.
Yeah, pretty simple. It's interesting to see the way the villains develop. Because I did get a little lost. I'm not gonna the way that it starts. Yeah. Is it like Nightmare to Mordo to Dormammu? Like, can you talk a little bit about those characters?
To a large degree, I think Steve Ditko and Stan Lee were making it up as they went along. So it's not like there was some gigantic plan here. Nightmare is in the very first story, which is only 5 pages long. And he's the ruler of the dream dimension. And because it's only 5 pages long, and there's a lot crammed into that story, it's one of the most economical sort of pilot story. And it does not tell the character's origin. It jumps in with him already living in the East Village. We see him visit the Ancient One. All the basics are there. But you don't get to see a lot of Nightmare's dream dimension because there just isn't any room. So it feels like almost and Nightmare comes back later, but it feels like almost more of a warm-up for Dormammu, the ruler of the dark dimension, who's he's almost a classic fascist ruler, communist fascist ruler. The complexity of him is that he keeps his people safe from the what they call the mindless ones, who are just these sort of charging energy beasts who are held at bay from the dark dimension only by Dormammu's own power. So while his people, who again you don't get to see that much of, but they under a totalitarian regime, there's an implication that they accept this to a degree in exchange for the protection he provides them. So it's complicated, but the dilemma that Dormammu is his enemy and wants to invade Earth, so he has to defeat him. He doesn't want to kill him or neutralize him too badly because the people of the dark dimension do rely on him. So there's a certain back and forth, and I'm making it sound all geopolitical, and it sort of is, but it's also the hero's dilemma. Is your enemy fully evil, or are there other reasons he does some of the things he does?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the sort of payoff of the sort of two-part introduction of Dormammu that is kind of interesting because, as you say, like the second part is sort of teed up as like, all right, it's going to be the big fight between Strange and Dormammu. You're going to see crazy stuff. But the payoff actually is that they realize they have to team up to, like, Strange has to help Dormammu protect his people from the Cyclopses that are the mindless ones. Yeah. It's kind of an interesting swerve that also, like, speaks to maybe this idea of there's not ultimate good and ultimate evil. And Dormammu has a code. It may mostly be twisted, but there is a code there.
Or at least he struck a bargain with his people to a degree. There is the second go round in the dark dimension goes on for much longer, and there's more of a showdown. And the mindless one stuff is a little bit glossed over there. And I think it may be partly because, as has been chronicled a lot of places, and I covered this in the book, Ditko left the strip very suddenly. His relationship with Stan Lee had gotten strained by all accounts. What exactly happened? It's complicated, and Ditko was a quirky man, and his writings, where he sort of half explains it, almost assume you understand what's going on in his mind more than you can. So it's complicated. But he left. Whatever happened, he left suddenly. He did wrap up that storyline, and he was fully plotting the strip by then. In fact, the last few Ditko installments, Stan didn't even script them. He brought in first Roy Thomas and then the very young Dennis O'Neill to do several issues. But he wraps up the Clea storyline, the girl in the dark dimension, who later becomes, under other creators, becomes very important to Doctor Strange. But exactly what happens in the dark dimension is sort of like boop, 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 really fast. So we're just done with it.
It's working out. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's working out. Don't worry.
So I'm interested in the plotting thing, because you also talk about how, especially in the 60s, like Stan, the editor, has to become Stan, the writer.
Right.
So he's definitely writing the dialogue, but so for most of Doctor Strange, is it really like Ditko is plotting it, or what's, I mean, during that run, because obviously he leaves, but
right. And you've hit on an area of great dispute among comics historians about who did what in a lot of those comics. It's a little more documented with Doctor Strange. Ditko appears to have brought in the character to begin with, though we don't have any paperwork on that or anything, as far as I know. There are to back up a little bit. What had happened was Marvel, which had been also known as Atlas and Timely Comics at various different times, had been a much larger operation. At one point, it was publishing, I believe, hundreds of comics a month, like a lot of books, and it had a staff. It had a large staff of writers. It had a large staff of artists. In the face of various industry setbacks, mostly the bankruptcy of American News Corporation in the late 1950s, which killed the pulp magazines, Marvel cut way back and was forced to accept a very restrictive distribution arrangement by the owners of National Periodical Publications, DC Comics. So they were they were effectively under the distribution arm of their rival, which limited them to a small number of titles per month. So everyone was laid off, and Stan was the editor, and the only way he could afford to get the books out was to write most of them himself. The only way he could write most of them himself was to give a lot of the plotting, was to not write out entire full scripts, but to give verbal descriptions to the artists and have them pace it out, verbal or written, like short written descriptions.
Sure.
And that's how the Marvel method, as it's known, developed, out of necessity mostly. And this led later to some ill feelings with artists like Jack Kirby, who felt they were doing more than their share and not being credited for it. And this is all publicly documented. I'm not taking sides on it. I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to in talking about a Marvel publication. But with Ditko, who was an objectivist, was a follower of Ayn Rand, may have known her a little bit, may have gone to one or a couple of her. He lived in New York City. So he may have gone to a few of her salons. His issues with Marvel appear to be a little more complicated and a little harder to fathom, and may have been a little bit personal, involving his relationship with Stan. So it where were we going with this? I was. What was
the division of labor was kind of
the division of labor. Yeah. So what happened? And this is documented. Early on, they would co-plot the stories, and that appears to be where you get a few more stories set in New York City with fake magicians and things like that. And then at a certain point, Stan gave full plotting power over both that book and Spider-Man, that storyline and Spider-Man, to Ditko. So Ditko would plot the stories and bring them in with notes in the margin, and Stan would lay down dialogue. And Ditko seemed to have wanted this. At the same time, it's possible he felt like, again, he was doing work he wasn't being paid for, and that may have been part of the reason he left. But we don't know that. We really don't know that. It may have been more of a personal thing. The relationship deteriorated one way or another. It's both of them are gone now, and Stan always seemed a bit baffled by it. To be honest. And Ditko was obviously just an incredible creative genius and a quirky man as well.
You don't say anything like major, but even just the way that you describe that he took over like his own inking because he just preferred the control. It seems like he just liked to have his as much sort of a holistic control as he could get.
Yes, absolutely. And he had started off that way. He inked himself on the first stories, and then somewhere in there, Stan assigned an inker over a few stories, but no, Ditko wanted it back, and Stan, I think, recognized his talent and wanted to see what he could. And Stan was overworked. He had a lot of other projects to worry about. So it worked for a while until it didn't, as a lot of these things do.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about some of the writers who came in, like Steve Englehart and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, after Steve Ditko left, the character was not in his own comic book at that point. He was appearing in the back of Strange Tales behind Nick Fury. There's a real round robin of creative people for a while for the next 20 or 25 issues. The most promising stuff is some of the storylines by Roy Thomas, who was quite young at the time. Some of the art by Dan Adkins, who had a sort of a classical science fiction sensibility. When they decided to spin the book off into its own title, at the point when they got out from under the restrictive distribution system I mentioned, Roy came on as regular writer, initially with Dan Adkins, but very quickly an artist named Gene Colan took over and did some beautiful experimental work. That's a very nice run of stories. It's very elegant in its way. It wasn't popular, and the book was canceled eventually. But it's a nice, it's a very fun run of stories to just sit down and read. It's very stylish stuff, and Colan was trying a lot of experimental, trippy layouts at the time, and the stories were loose enough for him, I think, that he was able to do that and still maintain clarity and storytelling. So yeah, those were a lot of fun. And then the character didn't appear anywhere for almost 2 years. They brought him back and as leader of a new superhero team called the Defenders. And one of the writers on that, Roy Thomas, started it off, but the writer who launched it in its own title was Steve Englehart. So he had been, and he was new. He was quite young, and he had been writing. So he'd been writing Doctor Strange in the Defenders for over a year at the time when he took over the newly revived Doctor Strange series, which is where my book sort of begins and ends.
I'm curious though, like in this like 2 hour or 2 year sort of fallow period, is it just because they're like, well, we have this character, let's do something with him, or like, is there enough like still sort of fan support being like, where is Doctor Strange? Can we bring him back? Do you have any sense of why he came back?
I do not know. I would suspect that Roy Thomas in particular had a fondness for him, having written the book for a while. And since he was the one who created the Defenders. Doctor Strange, the comic book, was canceled very suddenly. There's even a next issue blurb at the end of the last issue. And Roy finished off the story in two other comics he was writing, Submariner and The Hulk, which sort of provided the seeds for the Defenders, because those two characters are also members at various times. So he sort of set it up, but there was a long period, there was at least a year and a half in between where the character did not appear at all. And I don't know if commercially they thought, well, this character didn't work. We tried running his own title and they weren't sure what to do, or if they just wanted to wait until the right creative team came along.
Well, it's also so interesting too, because you talk about in his publication history that when he got his own title, he didn't even get his own number one yet. Like it was, the numbers just continued from Strange Tales.
Yeah, that was common. There's a really boring reason for that, okay. Which is that if the comic continued the numbering, it could keep the second-class mailing certificate that let them mail subscription copies at a discounted rate. Oh. So otherwise, you would have to apply again, and it usually took a year to 2 years to get it.
Oh, interesting.
So that's
I do like that. Yeah. That like how the sausage is made stuff. So so it's not boring to me. I appreciate you sharing that.
And the same thing happened with Thor. He came out of Journey into Mystery, and they changed it to Thor, but they just kept the. Whereas a generation later, when comics were primarily sold through the direct market, but certainly by the 1980s and 90s. You always restarted something within issue one because it would give you a sales boost. It would, but at the time, the things were just sold like dry goods through the ID distribution network, and they didn't really care what the titles were. They just sort of threw them out there.
Do you have any favorite stories or favorite characters from this run? Or I guess it's more than a run, but yeah, this era.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's as I said, the Ditko stuff, I'm not sure I'd ever sat down and read it all in sequence before. And, it has some shaky bits near the beginning. But once Ditko's doing full plotting, and especially when Stan's in good form working with him, those Dark Dimension stories that go on, the final storyline goes on for quite a while. I think it's 7 or 8 installments. And it involves Doctor Strange being hunted around the world as well. And there's some lovely little 60s type spy stuff in there too that seems like it wouldn't fit in the strip, but works perfectly. After that, the Strange Tales stuff after Ditko is kind of a bumpy road. There's some nice little stuff in there and some very nice artwork from a variety of people. But it sort of once it spins off into its own title, it settles into a groove a little more. There's some very nice stuff in there. There's a great story that crosses from, I think again, Marvel might have been trying to boost the sales of a failing title, but it starts in Doctor Strange and goes into the Avengers comic. And it's the first time, in order to save a fellow hero's life, Doctor Strange has to perform surgery on him for the first time since the accident. And he's sweating and his hands are shaking. It's a very emotional scene. It's very nice. So those are all good. And the revival was weird because it sort of in the 70s, because it sort of started with a single story co-plotted and drawn by Barry Windsor Smith, who's just a massively wonderful artist. But he didn't stay with the book. And then it sort of, again, it goes in through a variety of writers and artists until Steve Englehart and Frank Brunner come on and just sort of come on very strong and raise the scope of the book, increase Strange's powers, have him traveling back to the beginning of time, have him like in other dimensions. It's wild, wild stuff. And those stories held up for me on rereading really well.
Nice. How did you decide on the scope of it? Was it always just a decade just because it's like, well, that's neat, or was it because of the time loop thing, or what made you think of the scope? Because it's a lot of writers, it's a lot of stories to sort of encapsulate in a fairly small book.
It was a little bit holistic. Initially, Bloomsbury told us for the initial lineup of books, they wanted one book about a comic in each decade. So, and mine wound up not being exactly that, but mine is basically the 1960s one. Mm-hmm. It overlaps a little bit with Paul Cornell's book, The Mighty Avengers versus the 1970s, where he's also dealing a lot with the writing of Roy Thomas and Steve Englehart. So there's an intersection there. But I remember I thought, well, and when I looked back at the Steve Englehart, Frank Brunner stuff, their very first issue says 10 years ago this month, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko launched Doctor Strange. We proudly continue this tradition. I thought, okay, there's something there, especially since the story itself was about time travel, was about sort of going back and revisiting the past. So that's kind of how it came together, as well as I remember anyway.
Yeah. And I do want to say, so I have read all three of these first ones, that I did like the dovetailing with the Avengers book. Like, mm-hmm. like the talking about the writers, because like, again, like I'm coming to this as just like a guy who's read a few comics and has seen a bunch of movies. Mm-hmm. And it's really kind of nice to have these portraits of the people who are creating these characters, or who alternatively might have just been handed these characters and had to figure out how to do it, and, you know, smuggled in their own sort of style and message with it. That definitely, the Avengers one seems like it's definitely much more about like reflecting the times in the 70s. And this seems like, I mean, Doctor Strange is too, but in the way that you're talking about the sort of counterculture of the East Village, but yeah.
I mean, the strange thing, one of the things Marvel was very sensitive about with us in these books mm-hmm. is they did not want us to be, and rightly I'm saying, they did not want us to be imputing motives to people, to creative people, and I have tried to be careful about that. There's been a lot written about Steve Ditko. There have been several books about him just in the past few years, and they paint sometimes contradictory pictures of him. Mm-hmm. But the strange thing about Ditko is, you know, he did all this trippy stuff in Doctor Strange. And by all accounts, and I met him once, he was a very straight arrow. Like he was, he just sat in his studio and drew. He did it into his 90s. He had a little place in Midtown, very humble little studio in a big building. And he did his own quirky comics through the last several decades of his life, which are sometimes a little bit too objectivist for my taste. but you have to respect the guy. But the strange thing is, this stuff he did, especially in the 60s, was such an influence on artists and musicians of the time. But he wasn't really part of that scene. Like that mm-hmm. wasn't part of his life, and neither was Stan. Really, I mean, Stan became, once he started lecturing in colleges, he got a little more into all that. But he was a pretty staid married man who just who edited these books, and so yes, there's a back and forth. The younger creators who came in the late 60s and early 70s were more part of that. Englehart, I believe, talked about, he's the only creative person I've read interviews where he talks about actual magic and how it worked, and his own experiences. So he was drawing on that a bit more, where that wasn't really the 60s guys. That wasn't their scene, man. that wasn't their bag. So, yeah. So it's a funny back and forth.
I agree. I the little swath I read, like I think right before the Dormammu story, there's just like a fight with Baron Mordo that, like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh, this seems very much like, dozens of adventure films or mm-hmm. That I've seen. And then the Dormammu Dark Dimension, literally I showed it to my girlfriend, and we both kind of joked. It's like, oh yeah, I could see someone getting high and really getting into this.
Yeah.
But it's also one of those things that I'm like, yeah, but I also don't. Yeah, based on what I'm reading here, I don't think Steve Ditko was getting high and drawing crazy stuff. Like,
I don't know. We don't know, but
okay,
but
sure.
it doesn't seem that way. He and I write about my meeting with him, which was very short, and it was just when I worked at DC Comics in the 90s. He came in once, and he was just the most soft-spoken, ordinary man you could imagine. He had this reputation by then. He would write he would write his own personal comics and essays, and sometimes they were screeds against the entire industry or the entire culture. And but he wasn't that way. He didn't seem that way in person, not at all.
Well, we're getting close to the end. I did want to ask you about some of the other things you did, because I was looking through it. So when I graduated from NYU, I worked for a time at Troma Entertainment, I see that you have worked on the Toxie team up for Ahoy Comics. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Ahoy Comics is a small boutique comic book publisher. It does a small line of high quality books. I have been there. I've done publishing operations for them since the beginning, so I deal with distributors for them and all that. But I've also written some things for them. And yes, I wrote one issue of Toxie Team Up where Toxie met the Jersey Devil, who had appeared in a couple of other Ahoy comics by that point. And that was just fun. I grew up in Central Jersey, and I set it in I made it a big brawl in a diner, because that just seemed to be where it would happen. And it was fun. It was actually one of the silliest things I've ever written, and I'm very, very proud of it. It just came together really simply. Troma's been they've been an incredible publishing partner for Ahoy. The relationship has gone beautifully. It was all set up by a writer named Matt Bors, who writes the main book, and he brought it to Ahoy, in fact. So yeah, they've been a lot of fun. They're still around. They've been around forever. They're still like a small operation based in New York City, and it's been good.
Yeah, I can only have you met Lloyd at all, or Lloyd Kaufman?
Yeah, I've been on panels with Lloyd. At San Diego Con, mostly promoting the thing.
I was going to say, I can only assume that Lloyd is just tickled by any sort of attention like this. So,
he loves it. Yes.
Yeah. I also, I definitely. So I did work, like actually get paid a little to work there, but I started off as an intern. So I definitely put on a Toxie mask at more than one. Event. So
we had a panel.
I always have a fondness for Toxie.
They have a guy with a really good Toxie costume now, and he was. I didn't know he was going to be at our panel at San Diego Con a few years ago, and I was moderating it. I was up there, and suddenly there's the goddamn Toxic Avenger like right next to me. I'm like this, like that was creepy. He had his mop pail and everything.
That's excellent. Gosh, yeah, that reminds me. Yeah, once it was after, I think it was Citizen Toxie, the Toxic Avenger 4. It was a screening, and Lloyd was doing a Q&A afterwards, and he just brought me out to do the Q&A with him. And I'm like, I didn't make this movie. What do you want me to do? So I just kind of stood and posed while he talked.
Yeah. Yeah, he's great. He's a lot of fun. He's a little like, he's a little like Stan in that he's a very sort of cheerful, funny public face of his company. And in fact, when Ahoy started the Toxic Avenger comic, Tom Peyer, the editor, had asked Lloyd if he would write something that became called Uncle Lloyd's Mop Pail, which is kind of like Stan Lee's soapbox in the, and it's very funny and raunchy and all over the place. It's great. It's great.
Oh yeah, I'm excited. I only found out about it looking at your bio in the back of this book, so I'm definitely going to pick up Toxie's team up for sure. Well, it's been excellent talking to you, Stuart.
Same here.
I hope the listeners have been intrigued to check out the books. I mean, all three that are currently out in the Marvel Age of Comics, I would recommend. They're in our arts annex at SKYLIT Books, 1814 North Vermont Avenue.
Awesome.
We also, I think, will, if we don't, I will bring in Toxie's team up, because I think that is just fun. Anything else you'd like to plug, Stuart?
Right now, I've got. I did a book called Captain America for Dummies that came out earlier this year from Wiley. That was fun, and I may or may not have another Marvel Dummies book in the works. So I've got a few more Marvel things coming, but not. And I've got a new project. I've got a new graphic novel with artist June Brigman, who I've worked with before, but that's still a ways off. So keeping busy.
Nice. Is there anywhere that people can follow you that you like update frequently? Or
I'm mostly on Blue Sky, Stuart Moore, Blue Sky at Blue Sky, and on Facebook I'm Stuart Moore 1, and I think on Instagram I'm Stuart Moore 01. I have a website, stuartmoorewriter.com, that is badly in need of an update, but it has a whole rundown. It has my backlist up there. It'll fill you in on all the weird stuff I've done over the years.
Oh, excellent. Well, good. I hope folks check it out, because in the very least, my exposure to Doctor Strange: A Decade of Dark Magic was really a pleasure, and I look forward to more. Thanks.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.